migrants in Ecuador, more than 650 surveys of Colombian migrants in 6 provinces in the northern border region of Ecuador that you can see marked here. So I was trying to not just go to the capital city, but get out into the field a bit. And although I do use mixed methods in my book, I'm a political scientist. I'm using survey data analysis, qualitative case studies, and participant observation and network analysis. I am aware that this is an after-dinner talk. You've got wine in front of you. And so I'll follow the advice of the comedian Chevy Chase, who was playing the role of President Gerald Ford in a debate and responded, "I was told there will be no math." I'll try and stick to that today, and we'll spare you the math tonight. Instead, I want to begin with a few stories, vignettes, to paint a picture, to give you a little sense of the experiences that I learned about in Ecuador that shaped this book. So I was in a jungle province of Sucumbíos, which is in the Amazon, close to the Colombian border, and talking to a former official of the Defensoría del Pueblo, the Human Rights Ombuds Office. He was telling me that there was this kid, about 12-year-old kid named Miguel. I'll call him Miguel. Obviously, all these names are going to be changed in this talk, whose mother was part of a women's federation. And so they had a meeting in a little village right next to hers to learn how to do sewing as a micro-enterprise project. And so while she was learning to sew in the community little common area, the kid went to a friend's house and was playing and watching TV. At the same time, the Rio Sucumbíos runs right next to this village. It's actually on the banks of this river, and an Ecuadorian military patrol boat passed by the village carrying out routine reconnaissance, and they identified a suspected group of FARC guerrillas on the Colombian side and opened fire. They were trying to take out the bad guys. In the chaos of the exchange, a stray bullet crashed through the window of that friend's house, striking Miguel in the head and killing him instantly. Later, when investigators from the Defensoría del Pueblo attempted to find out what had happened, their questions were met with silence. No witnesses volunteering that they knew anything, admitted that they had seen anything. Their fear of retaliation from their own state was at least as great as their fear of the non-state violent actors on the other side of the river. In this case, the state's protection of its territorial borders from foreign armed force, this is the classic definition of national security, came at the direct expense of human security, by which the UN and others are talking about the individual freedom from fear and want of Miguel, of his family and friends. So this distinction between national security and human security is an important one, and it forms the basis for my book's analysis. In the hazy shadows and contested loyalties that characterize the transnational lives that many migrants are forced to live, the state is not the only and sometimes not even the best source of protection. The state's dual role as both the provider of protection and the enforcer of laws, and their democratic political incentive to protect the interests of their citizens who vote, not migrants who don't. All of that means that for migrants, they can't rely on the state necessarily as the primary source of protection. They have to diversify the sources of their protection and assistance. So they quickly learn that and adapt to that expectation. They treat the state with a degree of suspicion, and they rely on an informal network of friends, compatriots, organizations and churches, and even illicit service providers like coyotes or chuqueros, which are loan sharks. State incapacity or hostility at official border crossings often push people to more dangerous border routes called trochas, where they're exposed to illicit actors, potential violence. And so I'll show you This is me and my research team at one of the smaller but official border crossings. And these are a couple of examples of little back alley roads that look like they're just going off to the side, but the people in the region pointed to them and said, that'll lead you to one of the trochas that you can get across from Colombia to Ecuador if you know the right people and pay the right amount. So there is a whole ecosystem of service providers, security providers beyond the state. And I wanted to wade into those murky shadows and trace those stories, figure out how they work, why they work. Even when they're not experiencing direct threats of violence, structures of exploitation and precarity are woven through the lives of many migrants when their accent, their language, skin color, facial features, religious practices, dress, and other markers of difference can situate themselves outside the community of value that is deserving of protection, care, and a voice in the political decisions that govern their lives. They quickly learn to adapt to the expectations of the host community, reducing the visibility of their differences, either by withdrawing from social spaces, just trying to avoid other people, or by adapting their own practices to blend in. Colombians would tell me they would lose their accents. They would try to talk more like an Ecuadorian. Ecuadorians use diminutives, ito, cafecito, un momentito, and Colombians would start to emulate those practices as a coping mechanism, as a survival strategy, really. So I'll talk in a little bit about the language I use to describe this phenomenon, but this expectation of social invisibility, what does it look like in practice? Let me tell you a couple of more stories. I met a Colombian empanadas seller who I'll call Beatriz in a cramped kitchen just off a bustling street in Comité del Pueblo, a marginalized barrio at the extreme north of Quito. It's one of the areas that migrants and refugees have tended to congregate because it's one of the few places in the city that they can afford. Security is a problem, but it's where I was doing these interviews. So over the sizzling oil, gold-fried dough, and delicious aroma of the empanadas that she was preparing, which she invited me to sample, she told me, I stopped selling empanadas in the street because I was afraid. The migration police would come by, and if they hear a Colombian accent, they'd ask to see our documents. The photocopy of my asylum seeker document that I carry, she had documentation, serves very little use. They often claim that these documents are fake and detain Colombians anyway, or even tear them up. When I go out, I try to keep my mouth shut. So the marker of difference that sets Beatriz apart from Ecuadorians is her accent. They wouldn't necessarily know until she opens her mouth. For others, it might be their skin color. There are more Afro-Colombians than there are Afro-Ecuadorians. So when people see a black person in Quito, they assume they're either from the coast or from Colombia, both of which are stigmatized and have social sanctions. For others in other countries, it may be language, a hijab, or speaking a foreign language. This racialized marker of social difference becomes a brand, marking Beatriz as an other, as less deserving of protection or care, as someone who left their rights behind in their home country. And they're allowed into the host country by the generosity of the people there, for which they should be grateful and not make additional demands. The cultural expression of her foreignness also melds with stigmatized images that circulate in the media and the everyday understanding of Ecuadorians, providing a rationale for denying her care, housing, the enforcement of labor or education laws that she deserves access to, since she's assumed to be a member of what Marie Breen Smith calls a suspect community. She's the subject of what sociologists have called social illegality, the idea that undocumented status is assumed because of cultural or racial characteristics and sometimes actively manufactured by states, making it impossible to follow the rules set out for proper reception and integration. The result is a precarity that keeps migrants in the shadows excluded from formal institutions, fearful of social interactions that could lead to death threats from those they're fleeing, or incarceration and deportation from the authorities. It's a precarity that demands their labor and contributions to the host society, but refuses them the ability to participate in the decisions that affect their lives, or even from the full expression of their cultural identity, if this is different from the majority norms of the host society. So I mentioned the greater percentage of Afro-Colombians. Race becomes a marker of difference that is policed by this social invisibility boundary. I was in a focus group, and there were two Colombians. I'll call them Lydia and Cassandra, both of whom were sharing stories and say, oh yeah, when someone hears my accent, these things happen, they won't rent me an apartment, or other things that they had in common. But then they started, especially Lydia, the Afro-Colombian woman, started thinking about her contrasts as well as the similarities, and said, even though we have similarities here, you came as a university student, right? You weren't a forced migrant when you came originally. I had 5 minutes to flee after my family member was killed, and I came with that situation. My skin color marks me as visible. And so although the patterns of exclusion apply to both of us, marked by accent, the stakes are much higher in terms of the harm that people like me can experience as a result of that discrimination. And so you see intersectionality playing in here, where people's intersecting forms of difference multiply the kinds of challenges that they have. Whether that's an apartment rented to one of these women and not the other, attention drawn to one with darker skin and not the other, a state agent, racist, sort of out of racism, refusing services to one, or even police in some cases targeting one or both of them for exploitation or sexual violence, which happens frequently. So as I was hearing stories like this, I began to identify a pattern. And I've called it, this is the title of my book, The Invisibility Bargain. I think in most host countries, there is a tacit understanding between the host society and migrants. Migrants are allowed to exist, to come in, not be actively chased out. Their presence is allowed as long as they follow certain rules, which are not written but widely understood. They're expected to contribute economically with their labor or through some other valued service. For example, serving in the military as a veteran is an example of the contribution, valued contribution. And they're expected to remain socially and politically invisible. So I've talked a little bit about the social invisibility part already. What do I mean by political invisibility? Another story from the Pacific Northwest coast of Ecuador, near the Colombian border. So with the lapping waves of the Pacific Ocean filling my ears and a delicious plate of prawns and shrimp in front of me that he had harvested just hours before, a fisherman on the northwestern Ecuadorian coast learned what I was researching during my fieldwork and mentioned that he had previously served as a local elected official on the Junta Parroquial, the sort of town council in his village. I was fascinated and asked him more, but the conversation veered in a little bit of a different direction when he gave me his perspective. He said, Colombians have started getting involved in politics because they're smart and well prepared. Not too long ago, one even ran for prefect of Esmeraldas, despite being in this country for only 5 years or so. I think they're ungrateful, coming to our country, being welcomed, and then taking over. We as Ecuadorians are the ones who have the right to decide how we will be governed. So the narrative here of a political takeover, or even an invasion through demographic change and cultural contamination, is a common reaction of fear and resentment towards migrants, with echoes being heard across the region. Think about Dominicans in their attitudes toward Haitians, and their conversation about a sort of peaceful invasion through population change. Think about Costa Ricans in the way they talk about Nicaraguans who are fleeing, Trinidadians towards Venezuelans. And this discourse is a nightly staple on Fox News, where fears of Mexicans in the United States are frequently stoked, including this very language of takeover, of sort of political replacement. Social difference is not only a source of otherness, but is a marker of political threat to be vanquished and repelled, weaponizing the logic of national defense against the offending bodies of migrants who are seeking safety. This can scale up. It's not just an individual phenomenon. So this expectation that migrants engaged in political participation are threatening and ungrateful is widespread. There was a group of Afro-Colombian asylum seekers who had been denied third country resettlement. They said, we're still getting death threats from the guerrilla groups who originally threatened us, and they found us here in Quito. We need to go to a different country. They asked the UNHCR, who said they didn't have a country for them to go to, and they would need to settle locally. They didn't like that answer and didn't really quite get that the state is the one that actually makes decisions about refugees. And so they camped out. They had a little cardboard box camp in front of the UNHCR building. They occupied it for more than a week. And they had media attention, most of which was overwhelmingly negative. It was infantilizing, sort of dismissed their concerns, and also sort of painted them as troublemakers, potentially linked to nefarious actors and things like that. And ultimately, the police came and cleared their stuff away, forced them out. A group of Cubans did something similar in Parque Ejido and El Arbolito in the colonial downtown of Quito. And not only were they cleared out, but they were reassigned to what's called Hotel Carrion, which is an old hotel that has been converted into a detention center for migrants, where it's sort of a state of exception. Rules don't apply, people don't know what's going on, and magically in the middle of the night, a plane left Ecuador with over 150 Cubans. Due process out the window. So the idea of engaging in political participation to gain rights often has a backlash that makes it worse. Later, there's a sort of a symbolic effect. There was a Venezuelan man in the town of Ibarra, halfway between Quito and the northern border, who killed his Ecuadorian girlfriend, pregnant Ecuadorian girlfriend, in front of police, news cameras, and everything. And he was detained. I think I actually have, I have pictures. This is the camp that the Afro-Colombians did in front of the UNHCR, and a little quote there of the reception that they got, including the trucks that took their stuff away and cleared them away. You see the police encircling them. And then, well, I guess I must have taken out the one with the Venezuelan. That's all right. After he did this, the Ecuadorian president circulated a tweet that said, essentially, we will defend our sisters and mothers and kick the Venezuelans out. I'm authorizing people to go in brigades into the street to ensure control. All these phrases that were sort of dog whistles to vigilantism. And in fact, mobs went into Ibarra, to the hostels where Venezuelans were staying, dragged their stuff into the street and lit it afire, and then chased them out of town with sticks and threatened their lives. These are people who had nothing to do with that guy. It's just the fact that they were Venezuelans. And so you had, from the highest levels of government, this signaling of otherness, of violent stigmatization, and giving the signal that any counter movement was against the national security. So with all of this in mind, my argument is that states are accountable primarily to their citizens who vote, not migrants who don't. There's the invisibility bargain, which leads to precarity, gaps between the relatively formal, positive institutions that Ecuador has. The Constitution prohibits discrimination based on nationality. Refugees have the same rights, basic rights as Ecuadorians, but in practice that doesn't happen. And so in that gap, non-state actors emerge, especially non-governmental organizations, the Catholic Church, the UN High Commission on Refugees, and even informal networks. And because those actors act as brokers, negotiating between migrants and the state, they're more trusted by migrants, so they have better access to the migrants, whereas they also have the ear of the government, right? They're able to convene meetings and talk to people. They act in this intermediary role that allows them to increase points of access for migrants trying to gain rights, resources, recognition, and protection. So when I tried to understand what factors were essential for migrants navigating the invisibility bargain and choosing to access human security with their host communities, two big patterns emerged. One was networked governance, the idea that there are access points to a helping network of state, UN, and non-state actors. It may be that a migrant, when they first come into a community, only knows their cousin who is there, or the migrant organization, or the church. Those folks probably don't have the resources to give them what they need. They don't have security protection, but they do have relationships with the state, with the mayor's office, with the Defensoría del Pueblo, or whoever, and so they can provide references, they can go with them, accompany them to those places, and that network, you access it with the first point, and then the whole thing opens up. And so the places where migrants tended to have the best outcomes, the most protection and security, were the ones that had dense and diverse networks that coordinated with each other. Not necessarily places that had more government institutions or that were richer, which you might think. Quito is where you have the most government institutions and the most wealth, and yet that was the place where migrants had experienced the most discrimination, most violence, and were unable to, make a living. Whereas in the poorer areas on the border, where families had generations of cross-border flows, they looked like the people around them, discrimination was much less, and they felt more at ease. So this sort of networked effect seemed to be quite powerful. And if you're interested in these things in the book, you can see network graphs and some numbers to support it as well. But for now, you can take my word for it. The implication here is that the state cannot and should not be the only game in town. It's an important part of the governance network, to be sure. I'm not saying NGOs are perfect either, or the UN system, but when you have all of those together, you have different sorts of organizations, each of which have diverse missions and interests, and it's more likely that migrants will find somewhere as a first point of entry to gain access to the protection that they need. The second big pattern that I had identified was the power of personal interaction. Because prejudiced views and stigmatization of migrants often relies on stereotypes about a collective category based on limited information from the media or passed along indirectly in conversation, just what you see on the evening news, the best weapon to overcome prejudice is to foster meaningful, positive personal relationships between migrants and members of the host community. Building on a wealth of research on social and psychological concept known as contact theory, I heard time and again that when Colombians were able to build meaningful friendships with Ecuadorians, this was often transformative. They learned about opportunities for jobs that they otherwise wouldn't have known about. They learn informal cultural norms that help them navigate their new surroundings. And the Ecuadorians on the other side of that relationship came to know them as full people, not as that Colombian, but as Juan, as Diego, who works at the panaderia and has 2 kids he's trying to feed. They had a more complete image of what it meant to be a Colombian. And it was much harder to keep in their mind these stigmatized images when they knew somebody that didn't fit it. When I asked my Colombian interviewees if they knew an Ecuadorian personally, and if so, how frequently and where they interacted, I discovered that that answer made a world of difference for their views about Ecuadorians in general. So I promise no math, but this is the exception, a simple graph. And it's important because I asked them basically, where do you interact with Ecuadorians most of the time if you do? And it was things like the street, the market, the workplace, school, family, etc. And so places like the street or the market was casual interaction. You're not really getting to know them very well. You're just sort of bumping into them. Meaningful interaction was family, workplace, school. And for those people who had no interaction at all with the other group, the vast majority of them had a negative perception, more than 70%. Nobody had a positive view of the other group who didn't have interaction with them. For those who had meaningful interaction, more than half had a positive perception of the other group, and less than 20% had a negative perception. So you can see a very strong difference between those two. Now, what's kind of interesting, casual contact doesn't necessarily make it better. The big thing that it does is reduce the category of no opinion. So whatever you already thought, you believe it even more. It kind of intensifies your pre-existing thing. So contact itself isn't enough. It needs to be meaningful and positive. The same pattern works in the other direction. And these relationships have the potential to transform the stigmatized view by Ecuadorians of the migrant other. The paradox, though, is this, that even though meaningful social interactions with Ecuadorians make it more likely that Colombians will gain access to the government's network of help and find protection, that social invisibility expectation that they had pushes them into the shadows. They fear the social backlash of reaching out to Ecuadorians. And like Beatriz and her empanadas, they prefer to stay home and keep their mouths shut. And so there's an opportunity cost to being able to gain access to that governance network. So it's a heartbreaking paradox that you see there. So I think that there's fascinating stories that I learned from doing this work. The next steps, now that the book is out, are 2 big pieces. One, I'm trying to compare the experience of different migrant groups in Ecuador and outside to tease apart how group characteristics can cause them to experience elements of the invisibility bargain differently. I mentioned the Venezuelans. We've had some presentations already today about that. And so I did a comparative survey of 6 different migrant groups in Quito, including Colombians, Venezuelans, Cubans, Haitians, Chinese, and returned Ecuadorian immigrants who had gone abroad and come back. And I'm trying to see what the differences are among those groups and how these patterns apply. And I'm already seeing some interesting results. And then the second piece, with support from the Russell Sage Foundation, I'm testing this invisibility bargain theory in the context of the United States. So we've done a national representative survey of attitudes in the United States, testing very rigorously, including with an embedded experiment, how well this travels to the US. And also trying to delve in a little bit more to the psychological, individual characteristics within members of the host society that are likely to either intensify, make them more likely to go engage in backlash activities or less likely, including contact theory. I'm trying to nail down how powerful it can be when people have these meaningful, positive relationships with migrants. So at this point, I'd like to invite you into the conversation. For those interested in a deeper dive into the book, there are a few copies available outside, and you're welcome to see me afterwards if you're interested in that. For those interested in learning about the next steps of the US stage of the study, you can check out ivpark.com. That's the collaborative that we've named it, and there's some updates on the webpage about that. So thank you so much for the invitation to speak to you tonight. And I'm again so honored that my book was selected as the Whitaker Prize winner. And at this point, I'm happy to open up for any questions that people have or discussion. Thank you. I go here? Yeah.
Okay, so having read the book, I know at the end of it, you actually.
Could you please, everyone, if a little quick housekeeping here, so that our audience members on Zoom can hear the questions, we ask that you step up to the microphone and ask your questions at the microphone.
Oh, this one?
Right, very good. Thank you very much.
Are we turned on?
Go ahead. It's on. Speak.
Hello?
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So thank you, Jeff. That was really great. So having read the book last year, I'm the last part of it, which you didn't really talk too much about, or is some of your suggestions for what could be done to improve the situation. So if you would maybe just say something about that.
Yeah. So in the last chapter of the book, I have a list of recommendations, even in bullet points, because I have a sort of scholar practitioner identity as a person who also runs an NGO. And one of the things I try to get across is that instead of fearing a lack of state control, it can be a different paradigm. States can embrace the idea of multi-stakeholder partnerships, of thinking it's a good thing to have a mesa de movilidad that they aren't chairing, that maybe an NGO is chairing, or that brings together efforts from different kind of groups. So having more creative approaches to migration assistance and embracing a full coalition can result in more protection, which ostensibly is the goal. And so rather than just channeling money towards border walls or things like that, investing in a diverse architecture, a networked architecture of organizations can be quite powerful. The UN also is a mission-driven organization, the UN High Commission on Refugees, and there have been critiques sometimes that both gives them a sense of independence because they have the mandate in the UN Convention on Refugees, but it also can be a real limitation because it means they only are interested in refugees who have been declared refugees by the state. And there's a lot of people who fall in the gaps. Either they don't quite meet those criteria, but they're still forced migrants, or they do meet the criteria and just don't know how to access the system, or they don't have the money to go through it, or the state really is not doing its job. Here you can see the acceptance rate of refugees in Ecuador over time, and it varies dramatically, and a lot of it is by policy. So the big spike you see in the middle is an innovative partnership between the UN High Commission on Refugees and the Ecuadorian state, where they had what's called an enhanced registration, mobile brigades. They realized a lot of people who deserved refugee status were just stuck at the border, and the only place you could claim it is in Quito, like, a day's bus ride away, and you're not allowed to work until you get refugee status, but it could take 6 months to process. So it put people into just unwinnable situations. And so during this year, they had this innovative approach where they brought the registration process to the refugees and collapsed that 6-month process into a day and doubled the number of registered refugees that had that protection within a year. You see a less happy segment of the graph after that. From about 2014 to 2017, the state was changing its discourse from refugees to human mobility because they didn't want to be bound by the international law obligations of refugees. Also during this point, the statistics on the website for refugees was not updated. I know because I asked them every single year, and even would grill them in visits my students would have to them. And they lied to me a lot of different ways, but they didn't want people to know what their rate was of accepting refugees. And I found out why later when the regime changed and they finally published it. During those years, about 4% of asylum claims were granted, down from 40 or 50% previous to that. So there are innovative ways that states and the UN system can cooperate, and there's also ways that the political incentives of a regime can really steamroll this process. It depends on political will. So those are some of the things that come out in those recommendations. Other folks? Yeah, Brian, come on up.
Thank you, Jeff. The previous slide already anticipated a lot of my question as political scientist. So what explains state behaviors? It seems like it's not so much invisibility, but the pattern by which migrants make themselves visible to the state, and there has to be some reception on that side by the state. And of course, we know the states are complex bureaucratic institutions. Some of those institutions may be friendly, others might be less friendly. So I guess I just invite you to go a little bit farther with the previous slide to try to anticipate sort of what are the factors that make a state more receptive, particularly in sort of hybrid regimes where there is some democratic accountability, but there's also that kind of clamp down on different bureaucratic institutions, perhaps propensity to collaborate with the NGOs and the international governmental organizations.
Yeah, thank you. So it's not a generalizable answer because different states act differently. There are sort of broad theories of group threat, economic threat, when people fear that their jobs are going to be in competition, they are more reluctant. Cultural threat. We hear arguments sometimes that when a group is very different culturally, it can create more backlash. I'm trying to tease out some of those in the current research. I do think sheer numbers makes some difference, and I had skipped over this before, but I discovered that Latino Barometer is now asking people a specific question about their opinion about receiving different migrant groups, and this is Venezuelans. They also asked Haitians, they also asked several other groups. And the purple and yellow bars are negative. Purple is very negative and yellow is negative. And you probably can't see it, but Ecuador is the middle one in the brighter red square. And it's got very high levels of negative perceptions towards Venezuelans. The only two states that are higher than Ecuador are Colombia and Peru. Does anyone know what's special about Colombia and Peru? In terms of number of Venezuelans that they've received, Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, right? So first step is when you have an influx, it acts as a trigger point where states are forced to confront an issue that they otherwise might not want to. But regime type that you mentioned, Brian, does play a role. And I think that it did matter that a lot of this was happening during the administration of Rafael Correa in Ecuador, who was a transformative figure in Ecuadorian politics, a populist. He called himself a sort of 21st century socialism, citizens revolution. And he was a creative policy entrepreneur. So he introduced policies that were very progressive and welcoming of migrants and refugees. He introduced the idea of universal citizenship, in large part to appeal to Ecuadorians who had immigrated abroad that he wanted remittances and votes from, but he was able to have it a consistent argument. If we want our Ecuadorian brothers abroad to be protected, we should also protect Colombians here. And so I'm still working on what it is about a particular brand of populism that does that, actually in a comparative case right now with Turkey, because Erdogan also had a relatively open discourse for a while, and actually Turkey is the largest recipient of refugees in the world. And so I'm trying to compare those two regimes to figure out why they seem to have this kind of counterfactual or counterintuitive welcoming discourse as populist leaders when our own personal populist leader that we just had a very different discourse about migration. Yeah, Mike, come on up.
Thank you, Jeff. That was a really interesting talk. I look forward to reading your book. I wonder if you could go back a few slides to the flow chart you had, because I have a sort of right. So looking at this flow chart, it's very sort of unidirectional, very sort of linear. I can see certainly invisibility bargain, state accountability, gaps in formal security protection. At that point, would it bifurcate or go in multiple directions in terms of the actors that you're talking about seem to be benign actors, actors who are working in, with these communities? What about networks of criminality, of sex trafficking, of narcotráfico, of labor exploitation? Are there multiple ways that people who are insecure seek security, but not through benign networks or favorable networks, but through networks that end up being exploitive, oppressive, and gangs and so on? So maybe you can say a few words about that.
Absolutely. It's a wonderful point, and it's an important one. I have a nice, neat sort of figure that only tells a part of the story, like most figures do. In reality, if I did it more accurately, there'd be lines everywhere. The best book on that question is Annette Idler's Borderland Battles. And her Spanish translation actually just won the Lhasa Book Award, the Inter-American Book Award. She works on sort of illicit shadow citizenship, is what she calls it, illicit actors and networks in the borderlands of Colombia and Venezuela and Ecuador. And absolutely. I've talked tonight about the access to the helping networks within a governance network, but in some places, the main source of authority, like Lago Agrio when I went there, was FARC, right? There is an Ecuadorian military brigade, but during those years, they had a tacit understanding with FARC. You don't bother us, we won't bother you. We know that it's you going to these like 15 different medical places on one street in this small town, or gold pawn shops or whatever. But as long as you're not causing trouble, we're not gonna make a big deal of it. FARC essentially had control in that area, and people who wanted protection needed to have some understanding with them. One anecdote that I do bring into my book, I didn't have time tonight, is that sometimes the networked aspect of this can come back to bite people. And there are risks with it too. There was a Colombian family that was fleeing some paramilitary groups and came to Quito, and they went to a Colombian association, a group of sort of self-organized Colombians, for help. That group helped them find housing, helped connect them with a legal aid NGO that could walk them through the asylum process. And a few days later, it came to light that there was a note on the door of the leaders of that Colombian association threatening them, signed Águilas Negras, one of the Colombian's paramilitary splinter groups, that because they helped this family, they were now a target too. Also, the legal aid NGO, the Ecuadorian legal aid NGO, got the same letter. And so because they had become networked with this family, they were also networked into the threat. Now, in this case, they were able to overcome that because the legal aid NGO was run by someone who was very well connected, even though she was young, and she was able to connect them to the UNHCR, who got them resettled to a safe place where they could hide, got the Colombian leaders of that association resettled as well. And the police opened an investigation, and they even entered a denuncia in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which I was able to find. So the networking component can work both as a source of protection and as a risk factor, which is why not everybody's rushing to make the relationships, because they're weighing the pros and cons of those linkages. I think that both are important to understand. Thanks for that. Yeah.
I just wondered if you could comment on tension between the state and the helping organizations, maybe?
Tell me, elaborate a little bit about what you're
I guess
interested
I'm
in.
just thinking that, do you find that there is tension? Because clearly in a lot of times when there is non-state actors that fill a void, that's not always what the state
Right.
wants. And so it may be that the policies clash with what is, that the state has planned or the state wants to happen, or they are territorial about that. So I just wonder if you could comment if you found that or not.
Absolutely. So migration is tricky because it touches on core national identity issues. Who are we? If we let in these people, who will we be? Do we want to be that? Right? And those are really contentious issues, and they touch at the core of power, of identity, of these things that people really are invested in. And so not only are there tensions between the state and the helping kind of organizations, but within the different organizations and within the state. Brian mentioned the sort of the fallacy of the unitary state, that there's different levels, different organizations within it. And I would say that that was pretty important in ending that registro ampliado, that spike that I showed you where they had the mobile brigades. Mayors in the towns where they had these brigades were put under pressure when there's big long lines of Colombians waiting outside El Estadio. That's very visible. And people didn't like that. They thought that was threatening and insecure. And so the mayors put pressure back on the central government and said, I don't know if we should be doing this. Within the central government, the national security agencies were always skeptical of it. They thought it was too lax. And I think that they mobilized some of the political pressure on Correa to back away from it, to erode the content of it, even while he maintained the discourse of universal citizenship. Certainly, there were tensions where NGOs and others would bring lawsuits and say the state is actually not doing what it says it will in the Constitution. At one point, Correa responded to political pressure by putting out a decree that changed the refugee status determination process. So you had to claim refugee status within 15 days of coming into the country. After that, too late. Well, that flies in the face of all international law. You can't sort of put a sunset clause like that. And it abandoned the Cartagena Declaration criteria, which were broader, and said very narrow criteria. And that's where that period in my graph started, where they weren't awarding refugee status very much. I think that was in large part a backlash by the national security agencies within the state against this sort of political agenda of the president. Likewise, within the NGO and non-state world, there was a tension between the UN system and the church. At the first 6 or 7 years of the Colombian flow, the Catholic Church was the main implementing partner of the UNHCR. They would fund them. The church would dispense all the humanitarian assistance. And a little bit tongue-in-cheek for the Catholic Church, they got a divorce in 2007, where the church said the UNHCR is so mandate-driven, they only want to give that to those who are refugees, because that's what their donors are saying. That's what their mandate is. But we're the church. We want to give it to anybody who needs it. Not only migrants who are here finding a better job, refugees, asylum seekers, people in the middle, also Ecuadorians in the same area, because there was a backlash by Ecuadorians who were like, we're poor too. Why are you giving all this money to them and not us? And it was creating conflicts at the local level. And so they learned from those lessons. But in the meantime, I would interview people with church faith-based organizations, and they would say pretty nasty things about the UN system. And so there were differences about mission, differences about practice, strategies, etc. So yes, tensions existed, and it becomes a negotiation, a multi-party, multi-level negotiation. Yeah, Tom, come on up.
I was wondering why you picked Ecuador in particular. And if you have any plans to do any other this type of research in other countries in South America. The other thing too is the last graph that you showed, I guess it was the results of the survey from Latino Barometro. It is interesting. Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, which are traditionally countries that are made up of immigrants, have relatively favorable views. But there's what I think anyway is a bit of an anomaly, Paraguay, which at least in the popular perception is usually viewed as a very insular country. So anyway, I don't know if you have any commentary about that too. Thanks.
Yeah, I don't think I'm going to pretend to try to be a Southern Cone expert about it, but I will say that just to remind that this is a graph about perceptions of Venezuelans specifically. There are others about other population groups, and they're different, right? So it may be, I know Brazil has accepted a lot of Venezuelans. I'm not so sure about Argentina and some of the others, but in terms of the top negative ones, it tends to be the ones that have those. It may be for other population groups, it would be a little bit different. I do hope that this framework is useful beyond Ecuador. I first got interested in Ecuador working on environmental issues in undergrad, and then later I started an NGO doing conflict resolution work there. So my interest in Ecuador preceded this project, and it was actually, as a practitioner, conducting a dialogue between Colombian and Ecuadorian women in the town of Ibarra that I got interested in this topic. I saw how during a week they were able to overcome some of the stereotypes and stigmas they had about each other. And people would say, well, I always assumed all Colombians were bad, but now I'm listening to your story and I see that it can't be that simple. And I really wanted to dig in and figure out how that works. How can we get more of that? And that was nearly 20 years ago. That was 2005. It was where I traced the origins of this book. So if someone's having a frustrating writing day and are like, oh, this is taking forever, take solace. Others are right there with you. I do want to extend it also. Like I said, I'm trying to do a comparative thing with Turkey, with the US, and multiple population groups within Ecuador. Others are doing wonderful work in other countries. I know there's I believe an anthropologist who's written a really interesting one on Bolivians in Chile, and I recommend that one as well. Megan Ryburn, I believe is her name. All right, well, thank you for sticking with an after dinner talk. I appreciate your patience, and good night.